Hey there, my name's Daniel, and I'm a software engineer at Uber. I recently left Microsoft, and I thought I'd share some thoughts on my experience there. First, let's talk about the work itself. I think it's worth saying that this is very team dependent. I was on two teams while I was at Microsoft, and I really enjoyed the work I did on both teams. My org was rebuilding our product, moving from a Redux stack to a React stack, so there was a lot of building work to do, and in some ways it felt almost startup-like. Microsoft is a big company, but it's made of sub-orgs, which are then made up of teams, and each team is in a different life cycle building multiple features. You definitely need to come in with an open mind and a willingness to transfer internally if there isn't a great fit on the team you end up at. My org, and I think many other orgs, have a program called Talent Mobility. This means that you can transfer within teams within your org without having to interview at all. You just have to have a conversation with the other manager for the team that you're interested in. Let's talk about work-life balance. So from my personal experience, I thought the work-life balance is really, really good. Overall, managers were really responsive to honest conversations. For example, I had coworkers who told their managers that they were under a lot of stress and asked, can I take every other Friday off? And their managers said, yeah, they can. I think generally in my org, people work 8 hours and then sign off, and there's no expectation to put more than 8 hours in. Overall, work-life balance is great in my org. It's worth saying it can be org dependent and deliverable dependent. My org had deliverables, but there was a roadmap. So like we would have to deliver a new component in 6 months. If you're in an org which owns a critical piece of Microsoft infrastructure, for example, if your org owns a data pipeline, which is critical to like a lot of different teams in Microsoft, then your mileage may vary. Clearly, if there's a problem and you're a senior engineer and it needs to be fixed immediately, you're going to have to pull all-nighters to fix it. So I'm sure that there are teams like that at Microsoft, but I didn't have that experience at all. Let's talk compensation. This is a pretty hot topic for Microsoft in particular. So I've heard a lot of people say that Microsoft compensation is peanuts relative to the rest of big tech, but I think it's worth putting some things into perspective. Microsoft compensation is fantastic relative to the entire suite market. I'm talking compared to startups, mid-sized companies, even compared to a lot of the bigger companies. As a junior suite at Microsoft, you will likely be making in the higher end of 100 to 200K total comp. And if you have a super strong offer, you could even be making a little bit over 200K. I do think, though, that Microsoft's compensation falls off at the more senior levels relative to the rest of big tech. For example, if you check levels.fyi, you can see that Uber senior engineers make between 400 and 550K, but Microsoft senior engineers make closer to 200 to 300K, which is a pretty drastic difference. Let's talk about perks. There's a few different perks I want to call out. In-office perks include an awesome workspace. It's really a beautiful workspace. Very modern, spiraling staircase, game rooms. It's just a beautiful building to work in and a beautiful space to work in. Plus, they have free snacks and drinks. Any snack or drink you can imagine, they'll have it. And they have a cafeteria with subsidized meals. And the reason why they're subsidized is not because Microsoft can't afford to have free meals. It's just that they want to reduce waste by making sure employees are at least paying a little bit for their food. Financial perks include 401k 50% match, employee stock purchase plan of 10% off, a reimbursement program that gives you $1,500 of reimbursement per year and can be spent on pretty much anything you'd want. For example, Apple Watches, running shoes, a new monitor. If you take full advantage of all these monetary perks, the total value you get per year is about 15 to 20K. The culture at Microsoft is very strong. There's a shared understanding among all the employees that you treat other people with respect, you listen to your coworkers, and you are good to your fellow coworkers. I saw this within my team. I also saw this across teams and even across orgs. If you need help or want to ask somebody a question, they will take the time to call, spend time with you, explain whatever you want to understand. This is super valuable, especially for younger engineers who are trying to learn code bases and learn new technologies. Similar to the work content, the culture can be team dependent. For example, the first team I worked on was a bit older in demographic, more 35 to 50-year-old people. We did have young people, but the culture was more reserved, more mature. But the second team I was on was mostly young people. I'm talking 25 to 35 years old. Culture was more fun, spontaneous, sometimes rambunctious. People would talk about their personal life, people would have jokes. They really knew how to have a good time. I found that I liked that second team more, and that's why I say culture can be dependent on team, but across all the teams in my org at least, there was definitely a shared respect and an understanding that you treat your coworkers very well. Here are some tips for being successful at Microsoft if you're a new hire, whether you're a software engineer or a PM. First, I'd recommend that you be curious, not just about your own work, but also about the work happening around you. Ways you can be curious are looking at other people's PRs just for fun, showing up to other team office hours and asking questions, and coming to design reviews outside of the scope of your work to ask questions and learn about other people's work. I think the reason why being curious really matters is that you get a higher level perspective about work happening around you, and you can oftentimes make better decisions with that perspective. For example, if I'm building a new feature and I know a team has done something similar, then I'll be able to look at those PRs and potentially copy and paste a fair amount of code so I don't have to do that work from scratch. Or if our team is facing a challenge and I attended a design review and saw another team was facing that same challenge, then I'll know how to direct people to the resources that they need. Those are just a couple examples, but there are many more examples where this has been extremely valuable. The second tip I would say is put yourself out there. I think coming right out of college, when I first started, I was very reserved and I wanted to prove that I could figure out technical problems myself and prove that I was technically strong by going straight to the documentation. But what you'll find is that sometimes that's not the best strategy. As a software engineer, there's always a balance between learning a lot and producing output. When you go straight to the documentation, you learn more because you're actually reading the core documentation for whatever technology or question that you have. But it can be sometimes so inefficient that it doesn't make any sense. And also, sometimes you're looking at a problem which is specific to your team's code base, and you might not be able to find the right resource online. So I think probably the best approach is to time box the amount of time you spend on your own. At that point, if you still can't find a solution or still aren't making progress, then it's time to reach out. Definitely don't be waiting multiple days before reaching out for help. Exit opportunities. So with a Microsoft brand, you won't have a problem getting interviews at other companies. You won't have a problem getting interviews at places like Google, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon. But of course, you'll still need to pass hard technical interviews the same way that anyone else would. To summarize, working at Microsoft definitely gets your foot in the door, but it doesn't get you anything beyond that. You will always have to prove yourself in interviews, and you will always have to perform better than the next person. I don't really think it matters whether you work at Microsoft or, say, somewhere like FactSet or Expedia. Still known companies, but less well known. The reason I don't think it matters is because any of those companies, if you work at any of those companies and you apply to like Google or wherever you're trying to get to, the company's good enough that you'll get interviews and you'll get your foot in the door. And at that point, it's an even playing field. I do think, though, that working at a bigger company can help you in the interview over working at a startup. Because when you've worked at a big company, you've seen the systems that are involved in releasing software at a massive scale, and there's that shared experience and understanding that you have with your interviewers that you might not get at a smaller company which doesn't have those systems in place, those automations and whatnot. But at the end of the day, to be perfectly honest, what your technical interviews will come down to is how good you are at algorithms and system designs and behavioral questions. So I'll stick with my original answer that it gets your foot in the door, but it doesn't do much more than that. This was my overview of my experience at Microsoft. I hope it was useful. Leave a comment about what you'd like to see next.